This is a video I've been wanting to make for a very long time. So long, in fact, I've had to update the title. For many months, I wanted to make a video called The First Two Data Flows You Should Make for Your Company. But now with Fabric, there's some other great options there. So I'm going to try to cover both in this video and encourage you to consider two different shared dimensions that you share either via data flows or through table shortcuts with Fabric that might help your organization. And those two data flows that I recommend, I've been talking about them for a long time. Certainly, first and foremost is a date table. Just about every model needs a date table. Even if you don't have a special kind of calendar with an odd fiscal start date or ISO calendars or these 53 week 445 calendar or many other variants that are out there, date table is very important. And there's tons of content out there, blogs, videos with DAX and Power Query and approaches to generate those. I've put out a few myself, so I'm not going to talk about that in this video. But the other one, less frequently needed but often needed, is what I call a people table, and that's more for internal kind of analyses that are done where whatever your transaction system of record is in your company, you likely have some field there that says who did the work, right? Whether it's an employee ID or an email address or some other identifier. Having a people table so that you can slice and dice, do analyses of this VP versus that VP, or have a slicer that lets you choose the relevant subset of an organization for scope. That can be really powerful in your reports. All right, so those are the two I recommend, but really using data flows and now shortcuts that I'll talk about in a minute is a great way to share dimensions across your organization with other Power BI developers. So, this video is geared more towards the more senior developers, and you may have some less experienced folks that are building models and you want to help them come up the curve faster or get to good reports and analyses faster. Data flows and now shortcuts is a great way to make them more productive, to foster consistency across the models in your organization, help them, get to better reports sooner. So they're, again, focused on the analysis and reporting instead of also trying to learn modeling and data transformation and all that at the same time. Again, these approaches can let you leverage import and or direct lake models, which can be more performant than coming up with composite models on top of certified, for example, data sets or models, for example. It also sets them up so that if they do need to do additional transformation in an import mode model, that's possible. And again, data flows have been around for a long time, and they're an awesome option for sharing dimension tables or some fact tables. But with Fabric, you get even more good options. So let me show you what I mean briefly about these, calendar and date tables. So, let's say I'm a less experienced developer. I'm doing some analysis. I brought in some data from some transaction system of record. Obviously, there'd be many more columns than this, but there's some value here that I want to do analysis on. Some employee at some date did some stuff, and I need to analyze that. I could spend my time to add a date table to this model, maybe a people table if I wanted to slice and dice by organization. But if someone has already provided me with data flows or table shortcuts to these dimensions, it saves me a ton of time and maybe enables, helps my report along. So, this is a very typical calendar table that I use. Obviously, it's got the date column. It's got a few things I like. It's got these day and month columns that actually have zero width spaces at the front so that they sort in the correct order. I don't need to worry about sort by columns. Maybe you want to have set formatting for your year month or year quarter columns, for example. I also like to use these index columns, but I use a relative one from today for days, weeks, months, quarters, or years from now. It helps me minimize the amount of DAX time intelligence I need to do, and sets me up with these relative things to do, like today or yesterday or this current week or whatever, pretty easily with my DAX. What I mean by a people table is, basically a table that has, one row for every employee. It has their identifier, whatever's used in your transactional system, who they report to, both name and in number, maybe some more metadata about them, but also has added these columns over here. Maybe you have one that's just a full path that shows, from the CEO down what their reporting chain looks like, separated by these pipe delimiters, but then also splits those out into what level in the organization, depending on how far down the organization are, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I can use these as slicers or in matrix visual or whatever to show the breakdown by different org units. Okay, so that's what I mean by a date and a people table. And so if real simple report lets you bring in those transaction data, and again I've got my year month column from my date table, and then I've got this org slicer here. Again, these aren't very pretty, but you get the idea, and you can picture it at your company if we could have a slicer like this, or I can have it in a matrix visual, for example, to show different parts of the organization. Um, so I'm going to make another video that talks more about all the ways you can create these data flows and tables. But I want to focus this video on all the different ways you can consume this. And there are lots of options. It can be overwhelming. So I just thought I'd give my 2 cents on the different approaches and what I recommend you do. So, like I said, this is you here, your experience. You know how to do all this stuff, and you're trying to enable these folks over here that maybe have some fact data, but they don't have these date and people tables, for example, or maybe other dimensions, right? So, for a long time, you've been able to do the data flow, now called Gen 1, to provide those, and that continues to be a great option. With Fabric, you can do data flow Gen 2s. And if you stage the data in the data flow, it'll then be available for these model developers here to bring in with the data flow connector and do an import mode model, right? So that works great. With Fabric, you also have the ability to create these lake houses, and you can populate the lake house, the managed table portion or the Delta table portion of these lake houses with a notebook, with a Dataflow Gen 2, or a pipeline. If the data exists in another source and you want to copy and convert it to Delta, you can use a pipeline. Similarly, with a warehouse, you can create a Fabric warehouse and again use a Dataflow or a pipeline to populate that. Right. So those are there. Lots of these options are good. From the lakehouse, you have a number of options where you can consume the data. With both of these, you can go straight direct lake, and I'll show you that in a minute, where you can just shortcut the table from the lakehouse or the warehouse into a new workspace if you're building a direct lake model. For import, you've got a number of connections. I'll show you those when we go over to the query editor to pull in the data, and a couple of good options as well with pulling it in from a warehouse. So if I go over to the query editor, again, I built a whole bunch of ways of doing this just to try them all out. You definitely wouldn't have all these in your model. You would just pick one approach for your date table, one approach for your people table, and you'd have your transactions data, and that would be it. But I wanted to just show the different options here. So one is to just use the SQL endpoints. Both the Lakehouse and the data warehouse come with a SQL endpoint that you can get from the service, provide it to your devs there, and they can put that SQL endpoint in here with the SQL connector. They'll have to authenticate, and then they can navigate in and get the data, right? So in this case, just one of the date tables, for example. Same thing with the data warehouse, same exact approach. You get the SQL endpoint for the warehouse, navigate to the table, get your data. You can also use this approach that Chris Webb blogged about recently, how to use this new delta lake.table function And so this blog talks about how to do that, gives you the syntax you need. You actually do an Azure Storage.data lake function first, then you use the URL. It's important to also include this portion here for the hierarchical navigation equals true. And then after that, you can use the delta lake.table function to get the table. And then these other two I want to show is something that isn't obvious from the desktop interface. These connectors aren't available yet, but the functions are there. So let me jump over to the service and show here. One, I'll just show, I've got this workspace where I'm, creating these lots of different ways. You wouldn't do all these different ways. You would choose one or two and that would be at. But I've played with all the, making the calendar table and the people table with Dataflow Gen 1, Dataflow Gen 2s, loading it into the data warehouse, that kind of stuff, loading them into the lake house, also making the warehouse. In another video, I'll go through some of this and even show the Pandas approach, Python approach to generating the people table and even a date table, and share those scripts out in case they're useful to others, right? But once you've done that, so I'll show you this just as an example of how I found out these functions are there and can be used in desktop as well. So if you just create like a Dataflow Gen 2, right? And if I go, right click and do new query and go more, I can see all the sources here. And if you just look for there is a lake house one right here. And then there's also a warehouse one right here for those. And so if I say just choose this warehouse one and then I hit next, it'll allow me to choose from all the warehouses that I have access to. And then if I go down to this one here, the workspace was this first two shortcut tables. And then in there, I should have this data warehouse that I called for devs because I'm trying to enable the citizen devs in the organization. If I hit create, then I should get a list of the tables that are sitting in that Fabric warehouse. And then from there, I can navigate further to the table of interest. And so, you got some other stuff here as well, but I've got my calendar table. I've got my regular calendar. Let's just do that one. I've got my people tables here, a couple of flavors of that. And if I click on that table, I can navigate in and I've got my calendar table. Now, the reason I show you that, you probably wouldn't use a data flow from a managed Delta table. But I show you that just because if you click on the source step, you see this function here, fabric.warehouse. And then if I show you the equivalent thing for if I had selected the lakehouse connector and I go to that source step, you will see this lakehouse.contents function. Okay, so that was a long walk just to show you that if you go to desktop and if you do a new query here, and if I were to go to more, I wouldn't have those same lakehouse and warehouse connectors yet. Hopefully those are coming. But if I just do a blank query and I do lakehouse contents, open, close parentheses, and click down here, I will get a list of all of the lake houses that I have access to, right? And if I go down to this workspace down here, first two shortcut tables, that's the one I showed, navigate into that folder. Then I'll see the lake houses within that folder and say this one, that if I click on the database for that, then I will see my tables within the lake house. This one has a couple different date tables in there. And then if I click on this regular calendar one, then I've got my date table. And then similarly, if I put in Fabric warehouse. I click this will then show me all of the warehouses that I have access to. Actually, I think it'll come up to the workspaces again. If I navigate then into that folder for the workspace, and then this warehouse was called 4devs from my citizen developers. I click on that database. I will then see the tables within that data warehouse. And again, if I choose this regular calendar table and click on that, I will get my date table. And then again, I can import this. I can do additional transformations if I need to, etc. Okay. And so that just shows you how I came up with these approaches that I use. So this one uses the lakehouse.contents approach to bring in the date table. This one uses the lakehouse.contents for the org table. And then this was just an example showing the fabric.warehouse function, to bring in the people table, um, uh, for example. And then, of course, you've got your data flow options as well, Gen 1 or Gen 2. Remember, it has to be staged to show up in a Gen 2 data flow using the data flow connector. But I definitely recommend using one of these approaches up here and creating a Delta table, because not only do you enable the import mode use cases for your Fabric developers, but if we go back to the service, it also enables the direct lake one. So in this case, now I'm one of those developers. I'm a citizen dev, for example, and I've got some transactions data. I'm trying to build a direct lake model. So I've created this lake house, and I've loaded, I used the Dataflow Gen 2 to load my transactions data. And then I have this lake house. And once I have my data loaded there, I can then shortcut these dimension tables. You would only just have two here, a date one and a people one. But again, I've just been messing around just by going to, new shortcut and choosing one lake. And then, if I want to bring it in from the warehouse, I would choose this 4devs. If I wanted to bring it in a calendar table or a people table, those are sitting in the lake houses. I could choose those and bring those in, and then they would show with this little icon here. If I go back to the workspace, once those shortcuts are there, I could create a new custom model, which I did here. This transactions with DIMS. And if I go here and I open the data model, you'll see that I have the table that I loaded with my data flow that sits in this lake house. But now I've also got these shortcut tables that come from these two come from a lake house, and I've made relationships here. And just for completeness, I showed the calendar and people table coming from the data warehouse. That, again, this is redundant, but just showing you that it's possible. All right. So, that's just a little bit on, all the options you have for providing, shared dimensions that will be useful to less experienced developers in your organization. So hopefully you can leverage some of these techniques to help set them up for success. Thanks.